everyone, and welcome back to Module 9, the second New Deal. So, in wake of the first New Deal and the first pushes to pass pieces of legislation to cope with the Great Depression, that was seen as a remarkable achievement, and FDR accomplished a lot in a short amount of time. So remember, yes, that push for the first 100 days and to pass tons of legislation. So lots of jobs were created, and we create this sort of welfare system as a way to get people back to work and get money circulating in the economy again. Critics of FDR just say that he didn't really know what to do, and it was just a bunch of experiments. He didn't know what would solve the Great Depression, which is pretty valid, but all the programs that you did your project on, the end goal is to get money moving again. And remember the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. And the first New Deal is seen as a success. So things had not become worse, but there also isn't a lot of growth in the economy. So unemployment does not increase. Banks are no longer closing. The situation isn't getting worse, but it's not getting that much better. It's what we say, stop the bleed. So that'll be our first question, is for you to figure out, in your opinion, what you think it means to say that the first New Deal stopped the bleed. What do you think we're trying to say with that phrase? Okay, so let's talk about minorities and the New Deal. So part of your project was to look to see if the program included minorities, because some New Deal agencies specifically excluded and discriminated against minorities, particularly Black people. The Great Depression hit the hardest to disadvantaged groups. So we know from bank runs that it mainly affected immigrants and their savings they had in the bank. And, FDR is elected in the midst of a crisis, and he sort of does not have his priorities in order when it comes to including minorities and making sure his programs are inclusive. So he fails to call out racism and segregation because he doesn't want to alienate the Southern Democrats for voting from him and supporting him, because FDR is a Democrat, and then Southern Democrats who live in segregated places, he doesn't want to, if his programs were super inclusive and empowering, he doesn't want to lose their support, which is a choice, and it's your opinion whether you think that was a smart choice or not. But some specific New Deal programs did discriminate against Black people, specifically the FHA, so Black people could not get mortgages. And that could be a whole course in and of itself about how the FHA excluding Black people from getting affordable home loans set off generations of inequality in our nation. But that can be its own course. The CCC and the TVA refused to hire people of, who are non-white and practice segregation, or hired them for specific jobs. So let's pause here for a second question. Why do you think the New Deal excluded minorities from many of its initial programs? So just kind of think through that. Okay. So when we talk about specifically Mexican immigrants, suffered in particularly because if they couldn't prove their citizenship, they can't claim the benefits from a New Deal program. So if you couldn't prove you're an American citizen, because things like documentation for immigration wasn't super common during this time, or not really policing immigration a lot. It starts with World War I, but if you're in America previous to that, you wouldn't have immigration documentation. So if you couldn't prove that, you couldn't, get a job or participate in any of the New Deal benefits. So by 1935, so in the midst of the Depression, 500,000 Mexican Americans returned to Mexico because the living conditions would be better for them there. So speaking specifically about Native Americans, we have the Bureau of Indian Affairs created in the New Deal. And so that's specifically to employ Native Americans to make sure they get access to the relief programs. So this comes in the second phase of the New Deal, or the second New Deal, which we'll speak on specifically in a minute. So we passed the Indian Reorganization Act. So previous to this, there's the belief that we should Americanize Native Americans and sort of Christianize, and have them embrace white American, European American culture. But there's an acknowledgement that this Americanization actually pushed Native Americans further into poverty and was a demoralized practice. So the Indian Reorganization Act is focused on reinvigorating Native American traditions, restoring some land rights back, and helping Native Americans create businesses, establish their independent governments separate from the American government, and having tribal governments as well. So that's the Indian Reorganization Act. And specifically for African Americans, majority of Black people, especially in the South, are still living in segregation and could not vote in elections. So, they disenfranchised is not having your right to vote. They're living in segregated societies and still working mainly in farm work based on, the legacy of slavery and Reconstruction. So at this time, less than 5% of eligible African Americans were registered to vote, even though with the 15th Amendment, Black men, and then with the 19th, all women were granted the constitutional right to vote. Okay, so specifically talking about the second New Deal. So we began by saying how FDR is kind of ignoring racial issues and segregation. But the second New Deal, it's similar, focusing on relief, recovery, and reform, but it embraces social justice as a goal. So that becomes the new focus, and you'll see some New Deal programs in your next New Deal project focusing specifically on employing African Americans. So we have new programs to employ the jobless, more different tactics at banking reform, and this will all be covered in your project. Increases in taxation on your income and if you inherit money. And we also have, what's transformative and still exists to this day is Social Security, which is an unemployment insurance and covers when you're old and ill and you're no longer receiving a paycheck, you can pay into it as you're working and then collect on Social Security later in life, or when you're as an unemployment insurance as well. So if you're out of work. So the goals is to provide more security, increase social justice, so increase the inclusion of minorities in New Deal programs, and a lot more construction projects and developing America's infrastructure. So as with the second New Deal, we're sort of moving into, we'll talk about FDR's successes. So he was seen as a pragmatic president. So if a system worked, if a program worked, he kept it, and he ended programs that didn't seem to be stimulating the economy enough or being successful. He expands the power of the federal government, kind of to no end. He expands their role extremely and transforms the office of president, and kind of a lot of how the president functions today and what we see the president as being responsible for begins with FDR. He comes up with this Social Security unemployment insurance, and this concept that there should be a federal welfare system, that if people are in need and need help from, relief from poverty and unemployment, unemployment and homelessness, that help could come from the federal level, and you're not just on your own. And, increasing access to, different programs and advocating for higher wages for workers, all to help stimulate the economy. But a lot of these values stay with the Democratic Party to this day. Let's pause for our last question here. So based on what you've learned from this course, what would you consider to be one of FDR's greatest successes? So this is just your opinion, and maybe it deals with the agency you researched, or something you researched for the Living New Deal. What do you see as one of FDR's greatest successes? So let's just talk about quickly how the Great Depression ended. So this course focuses on the Depression and not on FDR. Takes us through World War II. He dies before the war is over, but he oversees our entrance and our plan for World War II. But this course is focused on the Great Depression aspect. But the two are very much intertwined. So the New Deal was seen as effective, but it's not strong enough. So essentially, what gets us out of the Depression is World War II. And how can a war get us out of a depression? That doesn't really make sense. It's essentially what FDR was trying to do with the New Deal, but just on a massive scale. So we had increased government spending to put people to work, inject money into the economy, create all these public works projects. But we were dealing with the Great Depression, a depression on a large scale. So what truly ends the Depression is the massive amount of spending we do in World War II and creating this military industrial complex. So this is called counter-cyclical spending. So you're spending against the cycle. So you're in a downturn and you're going to pay your way out of the economic downturn. So you think if you have less money, you're going to spend less. And then eventually you'll get more money. That's kind of that top-down approach. But the counter-cyclical spending is you don't have money, so let's spend our way out of the debt. Let's spend our way out of the depression. And that does work, but only at the massive scale of funding a war. So FDR he's our only president to get elected for more than 2 terms. He does die in his 4th term, and then Truman takes over as president, and Truman sees us through the end of World War II. And so that is the end of our content for modules 1 through 9. Module 10 will focus on a review and your final project. So thank you so much. This ends this lecture here, and good luck on your assignment.